You know, if somebody blindfolded you right now, put you on a plane, and dropped you right into the middle of a mid-sized tech startup.
Literally anywhere.
Yeah, literally anywhere in the world, be it Austin, Berlin, Bangalore, it doesn't matter. The moment they took that blindfold off, you would instantly know exactly the kind of place you were in.
Oh, absolutely. The visual cues are incredibly potent.
Right. You wouldn't need to see a sign on the door. You wouldn't need to speak the local language at all. The environment itself would just give it away immediately.
You're looking at, the exposed brick walls, the polished concrete floors. The acoustics of the room are probably a bit too echoey because there are no drop ceilings.
Right. And there is the obligatory ping pong table or a foosball table in the corner, the cold brew coffee on tap.
The open plan desks.
Exactly. The open plan desk with everyone wearing noise-canceling headphones because the open plan is actually terribly distracting in reality.
It really is.
It's like there's a universal, invisible blueprint that was somehow silently distributed to every tech founder on the planet. And the truly crazy thing is that it's not just tech startups.
No, it applies to almost everything.
Think about hospitals. You walk into a hospital in Tokyo, London, or New York, and the hierarchical structure of the doctors and nurses, the terminology they use, the way the triage departments are organized.
Even the pale, soothing paint colors on the walls.
Yes. They all follow this incredibly predictable script.
And we find that predictability comforting, mostly because human beings are wired to seek out patterns. We like things to be categorized.
Sure, it makes navigation easier.
Right. If
Yeah.
you walk into a bank and it looks like a circus tent, your brain instinctively registers a lack of trust. You want the bank to look like a bank.
But that psychological comfort masks a really profound mystery, which is the core of our deep dive today. We are so glad you, our listener, are here with us to unpack this.
It is quite the rabbit hole.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because when you stop and think about it, you have to ask yourself why. Why does every hospital, every tech startup, every university or government agency eventually end up looking exactly the same as its peers?
It's the fundamental paradox of modern capitalism, really. We are constantly fed this narrative that free markets are all about ruthless innovation.
Standing out from the crowd.
Exactly. Finding a unique competitive edge.
The whole point of business is supposedly to build a better mousetrap, not the exact same mousetrap as the guy down the street.
Right.
So is it really because that specific open plan office layout or that specific hospital hierarchy is the absolute scientifically proven peak of human efficiency?
Spoiler alert, it usually isn't.
Or is there some massive unseen gravitational pull forcing everyone into the same orbit? And even more importantly, when organizations don't follow the rules, when they aggressively break that mold and do things their own way, how on earth do they manage to get away with it without being ostracized?
To understand that tension, we really have to start with a concept from a scholar named Mark Deephouse. He coined this brilliant idea called strategic balance.
Strategic balance, okay.
Yeah, Deephouse essentially pointed out that organizations are trapped in a constant tug-of-war between two opposing forces. On one side, they face the pressure to be different.
Because you want to be unique to reduce competition, right?
Exactly. If you are the only company in the world that makes a specific type of smartphone, you basically have a monopoly. You can charge whatever you want. That is the drive for differentiation.
Okay, that makes total sense. That is the classic business strategy we all understand. Differentiate or die.
But on the other side of the rope is the pressure to be the same. And this is the drive for legitimacy.
Legitimacy.
Right. If your new smartphone doesn't look like a phone, doesn't have a screen, and requires the user to communicate via Morse code using a series of levers.
That sounds terrible.
It might be entirely unique, sure, but no one will buy it because they don't recognize it as a legitimate phone. Investors won't fund it. Regulators won't know how to classify it.
So you're just dead in the water.
Exactly. So Deephouse argues that organizations are constantly seeking a state of strategic balance. They want to be just different enough to have competitive edge, but similar enough to be recognized as legitimate players in their field.
Okay, let's unpack this. That drive for legitimacy, that need to be recognized and accepted by the rest of the world, seems to be the hidden engine driving all this sameness.
It absolutely is.
The fear of being the weird kid in the cafeteria outweighs the desire to be a visionary. And that leads us to a massive stack of research today about how this invisible engine actually works.
We have some fantastic sources to go through.
We do. We are going to explore the rule makers, the rule followers, and the ultimate rule breakers. So what exactly are we looking at today?
Well, our journey today rests on some truly foundational research in the field of organizational sociology. We will be looking at Paul DiMaggio and Walter Powell's landmark work on institutional isomorphism.
That's a mouthful, but we'll get into it.
We will. Then we will bring in Christine Oliver's framework on how organizations strategically respond to these pressures. From there, we explore the concept of institutional work through the lens of Thomas Lawrence and Roy Sotheby.
Awesome. And we've got some case studies too, right?
Yes, to prove that this isn't just abstract theory, we will ground everything into very modern real-world case studies. We've got Delphine Jabassier's research on how environmental accounting was created in France.
And the financial one.
Right, a study by Helene Rainelli-Weiss and Isabel Holt on how elite financial markets fiercely resisted European regulation after the 2008 crash.
Okay, so we are going from understanding passive conformity, why organizations just go along to get along, to exploring the highly active and sometimes incredibly manipulative ways that powerful actors completely bend the rules to their own will.
It's quite a spectrum.
To understand how the rule breakers manipulate the system, we first have to thoroughly understand the system itself. We need to know why organizations usually conform in the first place.
And this is where Paul DiMaggio and Walter Powell revolutionized the field back in 1983. They published a paper that challenged the most deeply held, taken-for-granted assumption in economics and business management.
Which is what?
The idea that organizations do what they do purely because it makes them more efficient.
Right. If a company adopts a new software system or changes its management structure or, I don't know, opens a new department, the default assumption is that some executive ran a cost-benefit analysis.
They crunched the numbers.
Yeah, and determined that this change would save money, increase output, or generate more profit. We assume a hyper-rational, calculator-driven world.
But DiMaggio and Powell looked at massive sets of data across different industries and said, wait a minute, once a certain field of organizations becomes structured, say the field of higher education or the field of automotive manufacturing.
Once it matures, basically.
Right. Once it matures, the constant changes they make actually do not make them more efficient. In fact, many of these changes are incredibly costly and highly disruptive, and they yield absolutely zero measurable improvement in the bottom line.
Wow. So why do it?
Well, the only thing these changes actually accomplish is making the organization look more similar to its peers. They called this constraining process institutional isomorphism.
Isomorphism. Let's break that word down for a second so you have a solid grip on it. Iso meaning same, and morph meaning shape, taking on the same shape.
That is the literal translation, yes.
Yeah.
In sociology, isomorphism is defined as a constraining process that forces one unit in a population to resemble other units that face the same set of environmental conditions.
Okay.
What DiMaggio and Powell argued is that as a field matures, organizations aren't just desperately trying to be efficient, they're desperately trying to be legitimate. They want to be seen as socially worthy, as valid, as a proper version of whatever they are claiming to be.
Let me test this with a startup example. A tiny new software company buys a $3,000 custom ping pong table and installs a kombucha tap in the break room.
Classic.
They are absolutely bleeding cash. They aren't doing this because there's a peer-reviewed scientific study proving that ping pong increases a software developer's coding speed by 20%.
Definitely not.
They are doing it because if a venture capitalist from Silicon Valley walks into their office and doesn't see a ping pong table, the investor might subconsciously think, are these guys even a real tech startup? Maybe they don't get the culture. Maybe my money isn't safe here.
That is a flawless micro-level illustration. The startup is purchasing legitimacy, not efficiency. And DiMaggio and Powell identified three highly specific pressures that drive this phenomenon, three forces that push everyone into what they famously called the iron cage of sameness.
The iron cage. I love that phrase.
It's very evocative. So the first of these forces is coercive isomorphism.
Coercive. That sounds forceful, almost aggressive, like you don't have a choice in the matter.
Because you largely don't. Coercive isomorphism stems from political influence and the fundamental problem of legitimacy. It's when organizations are essentially forced to adopt certain structures or practices by a more powerful entity.
Got it.
The most obvious and widespread example of this is a government mandate.
Okay, so think about something like the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, that the European Union rolled out a few years ago. Suddenly, virtually every website on the entire internet had to implement those little cookie consent pop-ups.
Oh, yes. Everywhere.
It didn't make the websites run faster. It didn't make them more efficient. In fact, it cost companies millions of dollars in legal and web development fees. But if you wanted to operate legally in Europe, you were coerced into adopting the exact same user interface feature as everyone else.
Yeah.
The internet became isomorphic.
It did. And that coercion doesn't just come from the government. It happens constantly in the corporate world through supply chains and acquisitions.
How so?
Imagine a massive multinational corporate conglomerate buys a successful, quirky little regional subsidiary. The small company has its own weird, homegrown accounting system that works perfectly well for them. But the parent company mandates that they switch to the global corporate enterprise software.
Even if that massive enterprise software is clunky, slow, and totally overkill for the small subsidiary's needs, it destroys their local efficiency, but the parent company needs everything standardized, so the quarterly reports match up. The subsidiary is coerced into sameness.
Yes. It is direct, it is explicit, and it usually relies on formal authority or the threat of legal or financial sanctions.
Makes sense.
But the second pressure is where human psychology really starts to take the wheel, and this is arguably the most pervasive force of the three. This is mimetic isomorphism.
Mimetic, from the same root as mimicking or miming, copying someone else.
Exactly. Mimetic isomorphism results from standard, almost reflex-level responses to uncertainty. DiMaggio and Powell point out that organizations frequently operate in environments where their goals are ambiguous, or the environment creates deep symbolic uncertainty, or the technology they are trying to use is poorly understood.
Basically, situations where the executives are sitting in the boardroom looking at each other and nobody actually has a clue what the right answer is.
Precisely. And when leaders are confronted with that level of profound existential ambiguity, performing a rational, deeply researched cost-benefit analysis is often impossible or just way too expensive. So they engage in what the literature calls a problematic search.
What does a problematic search look like in practice? Because that sounds like a fancy way of saying Googling what your competitor is doing.
In a sense, it is. A problematic search means that instead of trying to invent a novel solution from scratch, you look around your environment for an organization that appears to be successful and you simply adopt their practices.
You just steal their homework.
You borrow their blueprint. It provides a viable solution with very little expense. Why reinvent the wheel when the company across the street already has a wheel that seems to be rolling just fine?
I always try to map these grand theories back to normal human behavior. And mimetic isomorphism reminds me so much of teenagers in a high school cafeteria.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Think about it. When you are a 14-year-old freshman, you're experiencing the absolute peak of environmental uncertainty. You don't know what the social rules are. You don't know what's cool. You don't know where it's safe to sit.
It's terrifying.
It is. So what do? You don't pull out a clipboard and perform a rational analysis of cafeteria seating dynamics. You just look at what the popular kids are wearing, how they are talking, and where they are sitting, and you mimic them. You copy the successful peers to gain social legitimacy and avoid getting laughed at.
The underlying social mechanics are remarkably similar, and we see this cafeteria dynamic play out on massive, civilization-altering historical scales. DiMaggio and Powell bring up an incredible historical example regarding Japan's modernizers in the late 19th century during the Meiji Restoration.
Oh, this is a fascinating era. Japan had been essentially closed off to the world for centuries, and suddenly they decided they needed to rapidly modernize their entire society to avoid being colonized by Western powers.
Talk about environmental uncertainty.
They had to build a modern nation-state practically overnight.
And they didn't do it through trial and error or slow internal innovation. They engaged in massive, state-sponsored mimetic isomorphism. The imperial government sent its top officers and scholars out into the world to study apparently successful Western prototypes.
They went on a tour.
They essentially went shopping for government institutions. They studied and copied the courts, the army, and the police system in France. They looked at their island geography and decided to model their navy and their postal system entirely after Great Britain. And they copied the banking system and the approach to art education from the United States.
That is staggering. They literally walked around the global high school cafeteria and cherry-picked the popular kids for every single different department of their new government. We'll take the British Navy, the French Army, and the American banks, please.
It's exactly what they did. And the irony is that a century later, American corporations returned the favor through the exact same mimetic pressure.
Oh, how so?
Well, in the 1980s, U.S. manufacturing firms, particularly in the automotive industry, were facing thorny, complex productivity and quality control issues. They were losing market share, and they didn't understand why. So, confronted with this uncertainty, what did they do?
They looked at Japan?
They looked across the Pacific at the incredibly successful Japanese automotive manufacturers, and they suddenly started adopting Japanese models of quality control
Oh, yeah, I
circles.
remember reading about this. American managers were forcing workers in Detroit to do morning calisthenics and hold group harmony meetings just because they saw Toyota doing it in Tokyo.
Yes. And what DiMaggio and Powell note is that there is often a deeply ritualistic aspect to this copying. The American companies adopted these Japanese innovations to enhance their legitimacy, to signal to Wall Street and their shareholders, hey, look at us, we are taking action, we are adopting the absolute latest management trends.
Performative.
Highly performative. They did this even if they had absolutely no empirical evidence that a Japanese management style rooted in a completely different cultural context would actually solve the specific problems on an American factory floor. The copying is the point.
That is the perfect segue to a question I have been wanting to ask. When these American CEOs are sitting around saying, let's copy Toyota, is this a conscious, manipulative choice? Are they saying, look, I know these morning calisthenics won't actually fix our supply chain, but it will look great on the cover of Forbes magazine, so let's do it for the PR? Or is it a genuine panicked reflex? Do they actually believe they're making a rational choice?
It is a mixture, but the literature strongly argues that much of this is actually pre-rational.
Pre-rational.
Yeah, it reflects deeply embedded cognitive predispositions and cultural scripts. It's not usually a cynical, long-range, strategic mastermind move. Most managers genuinely believe they are making a rational, efficiency-driven choice.
So they don't even see the strings pulling them.
They don't realize that their vision is constrained by structural determinants. The menu of options they are choosing from has already been limited by what their peers are doing. They are stumbling in the dark, and they grab onto the first solid thing they feel, which is usually the shoulder of the person standing right next to them.
Okay, so we have coercive isomorphism, which is a gun to your head. We have mimetic isomorphism, which is copying the popular kid when you are confused. What is the third pressure driving us all into this iron cage of sameness?
The third is normative isomorphism. And this one is deeply, inextricably linked to professionalization. Think about universities, massive professional training institutions, and industry associations. These bodies act as massive societal-level filters.
Let's break that down. How do universities act as filters?
Consider where the top tier of management at almost any major Fortune 500 corporation comes from. The labor pool for those elite positions is remarkably shallow. They largely go to the exact same top-tier business schools, Harvard, Wharton, Stanford.
Usual suspects.
Right. While they are there, they are taught the exact same curriculum by professors who all read the exact same academic journals. They are taught to use the exact same frameworks to analyze problems.
So by the time they graduate, they have been completely reprogrammed to think in a specific way.
Exactly. And when these individuals are hired across dozens of different fiercely competing companies, they bring with them the exact same worldview, the same vocabulary, and the same methodological approaches. Furthermore, they join the same professional associations.
Right, the networking events.
Human resource directors go to the same HR conferences. Chief financial officers read the same financial standards boards. These associations define the normative rules of what proper professional management looks like.
I see. So even if two companies are locked in a bitter, cutthroat rivalry to destroy each other in the marketplace, the people actually running those companies are essentially intellectual clones of one another. If both CEOs learn that the proper way to handle a downturn is to lay off 10% of the workforce and consolidate middle management, they will both do it independently because that is the normative standard they were trained in.
That's exactly it. The homogenization of the organizational field is a direct result of the homogenization of the labor pool. The people making the decisions are interchangeable, so the decisions they make become interchangeable.
So DiMaggio and Powell basically give us a world where everyone is locked in an iron cage. We're all wearing the same clothes and working in the same open plan offices because the government forced us, we panicked and copied our neighbor, or we all went to the same business school and forgot how to think differently.
It is a somewhat bleak, deterministic view of the world. It paints organizations as largely passive, swept along by massive social currents they barely understand and cannot control. It is incredibly insightful, but it paints a picture of a world full of victims.
But here's where it gets really interesting, because if we look out the window at the real world, if these pressures are so absolute and so intense, why isn't literally every single organization a perfect carbon copy?
Right. Because they aren't.
We do see massive innovation. We see companies that completely break the mold, tell the regulators to back off, invent entirely new business models, and not only survive, but thrive. If the iron cage is so strong, how do the escape artists pull it off?
That exact question is what drove the next major leap in this field. And it brings us to a scholar named Christine Oliver and her seminal 1991 framework. Oliver's work represents a brilliant pivot.
What did she do differently?
She looked at institutional theory and recognized that it was phenomenal at explaining conformity, but it was almost entirely blind to the strategic active behaviors that organizations use in direct response to those pressures.
She basically said organizations aren't just sitting there taking it, they fight back.
Yes. To understand how they fight back, Oliver merged institutional theory with another deeply influential concept called resource dependence theory.
Okay, let's translate resource dependence theory for those of us who haven't spent a decade in a sociology department. What does it mean in plain English?
In short, resource dependence theory argues that no organization is entirely self-sufficient. Every organization needs resources to survive: money, raw materials, personnel, favorable legislation. Because they depend on their environment for these resources, they are vulnerable.
Okay, that tracks.
Therefore, their primary strategic goal is to manage their environment to ensure those resources keep flowing, which requires them to maximize their autonomy and exert power over external actors.
So if institutional theory says organizations passively conform to survive, resource dependence theory says organizations actively manipulate their environment to survive.
Exactly. And Oliver brilliantly brought these two opposing ideas together. She proposed that organizations possess a whole spectrum of active strategic responses to external pressures. It is not just a binary yes or no choice of conform or die. She mapped out 5 specific strategic responses, ranging from complete passivity to aggressive dominance.
Let's walk through the spectrum, because to me this reads like a master playbook for organizational survival. Let's invent a hypothetical company and run through this. Let's call them DataStream.
DataStream.
Yeah.
I like it.
They're a mid-sized cloud storage company. And let's imagine a brand new, highly restrictive government regulation is just passed called the Omnibus Privacy Act, which demands that DataStream completely overhaul how they encrypt user data. It's going to cost them a fortune. What is the first strategy on Oliver's spectrum?
The first one is what DiMaggio and Powell were talking about: acquiescence.
The path of least resistance.
Yes. Acquiescence includes habit, imitation, or conscious compliance. You just follow the invisible, taken for granted norms, you mimic institutional models, or you strictly obey the rules.
So what does that mean for DataStream?
For your hypothetical company, DataStream, acquiescence means they read the new Omnibus Privacy Act, sigh heavily, write the massive check, hire the compliance officers, and overhaul their entire encryption system exactly as the government demanded. They obey.
They stay in the iron cage.
Mm-hmm.
But let's move one step further down the spectrum, away from pure submission. The second strategy is compromise. What does that look like?
Compromise involves balancing, pacifying, or bargaining with multiple constituents. Organizations are rarely facing just one single pressure in a vacuum. DataStream isn't just dealing with the government regulators. They also have a board of directors demanding higher profit margins and investors who will pull their funding if the company spends too much on compliance.
So they are caught in the crossfire.
Precisely. So they negotiate, they try to placate the institutional elements without fully capitulating to any single one.
Give me an example.
In our scenario, DataStream might send lobbyists to bargain with the regulators. They might say, look, we agree with the spirit of the law, but overhauling everything by Q3 will bankrupt us. What if we negotiate a phased rollout over 3 years, and in exchange, we provide the government with a backdoor to certain anonymized data sets?
Okay.
They are pacifying the regulator while balancing the financial demands of their board.
They're bending the bars of the cage just a little bit. Now, moving further into active resistance, we hit the third strategy: avoidance. This one fascinates me. How does an organization avoid a rule without officially breaking it?
Oh, avoidance is where the true bureaucratic creativity begins. Avoidance can mean concealing nonconformity, essentially. Disguising the fact that you aren't actually following the rules, it's creating a facade of compliance. It can also mean buffering parts of the organization from inspection.
Buffering. Give me an example of buffering.
Imagine DataStream realizes the new encryption standards will completely slow down their core server infrastructure, ruining their product. So they create a very small, highly publicized, incredibly compliant data security task force.
A task force.
Of course.
This task force writes pristine reports, interfaces constantly with the government inspectors, and acts as a buffer. Meanwhile, deep in the basement, the actual engineering team just keeps running the old, fast, unencrypted servers behind closed doors. The compliant department absorbs the regulatory pressure, protecting the technical core from having to change.
That is incredibly sneaky. It's the organizational equivalent of sweeping the dirt under the rug just before your parents inspect your room.
But Oliver says avoidance can also mean escaping the domain entirely, right?
Yes. If the Omnibus Privacy Act only applies to cloud storage companies operating in the consumer sector, Adastream might simply decide to stop selling to consumers altogether.
They just pivot.
They pivot their entire business model to only sell B2B business-to-business cloud storage, which happens to be exempt from the law. They change their goals or activities so the pressure literally no longer applies to them. They just walk off the playing field.
So that's avoidance. But what if they don't want to hide and they don't want to run away? What if they just look the regulator in the eye and say, no, we aren't doing that? That brings us to the fourth strategy, defiance.
Defiance is the explicit rejection of institutional norms. An organization dismisses, challenges, or outright attacks the institutional rules. They do this when they feel the rules are fundamentally inconsistent with their internal goals or when they believe they have the power to win a direct confrontation. So Datastream doesn't negotiate, and they don't hide.
Yes.
They hold a press conference.
Yes.
They publicly assault the sources of institutional pressure. They declare that the Omnibus Privacy Act is an unconstitutional overreach that destroys innovation. They hire a small army of corporate lawyers, and they sue the federal regulatory agency, tying the law up in court for a decade.
That is textbook defiance. It is risky, it is highly visible, but if they win, they maintain complete autonomy over their resources. But Oliver doesn't stop there. There is a grand finale to this spectrum. The fifth, most active and most aggressive strategic response. Manipulation.
Manipulation. That is a loaded word. What does that mean in an organizational context?
Manipulation goes far beyond simply defying a rule. It seeks to actively co-opt, influence, or completely control the source of the pressure itself.
So you don't just fight the rule book.
You reach across the table, grab the pen out of the regulator's hand, and you rewrite the rulebook to favor yourself. You actively shape the values and criteria that define what is considered legitimate in your field.
Okay, this is the masterstroke. How would Datastream pull off manipulation?
Datastream realizes that Omnibus Privacy Act is inevitable. But instead of fighting it, they manipulate it. They hire the former head of the regulatory agency to be their new vice president of compliance.
Classic revolving door.
Exactly. They use their massive wealth to fund independent academic think tanks that produce research suggesting that the only truly safe way to encrypt data is using a highly specific proprietary algorithm. An algorithm that Datastream just happened to patent last year.
Oh, wow.
They lobby the government to adopt their patented algorithm as the mandatory national standard in the new law. If they succeed, they haven't just complied with the law, they have weaponized the law. Now, every single one of Datastream's competitors is legally forced to pay Datastream licensing fees to use their algorithm, or face being shut down by the government. They co-opted the source of pressure and turned it into a massive competitive advantage.
That is diabolical. But it brings up a crucial question. How does a company know which of these 5 strategies to use? Do the executives at Datastream just wake up on a Tuesday, spin a wheel, and say, let's try defiance today?
It is entirely calculated based on the specific environment. Oliver detailed 5 predictive factors that determine which strategy an organization will likely deploy. Think of them as the 5 C's: cause, constituents, content, control, and context.
Let's run through these because this really clarifies why companies behave the way they do. First up is cause.
Cause asks, why is the organization being pressured? What is the rationale behind the demand? If the pressure is merely to achieve social legitimacy, like adopting a new corporate social responsibility pledge that has no real teeth, an organization might be tempted to use avoidance or compromise.
But what if it affects the bottom line?
Well, if conforming to the pressure actually aligns with economic efficiency, like if adopting a new supply chain standard actually saves them money, they are highly likely to acquiesce.
Right, if doing the right thing also makes you rich, you just do it. Second factor, constituents.
Constituents asks, who is exerting the pressure? Is it a single unified entity, like a single monolithic government agency? If so, you might have to acquiesce. But what if you have multiple, deeply conflicting demands? The state government wants you to build your factory using local, expensive steel, but your international shareholders are threatening to fire you if you don't use cheap, imported steel.
That's the crossfire scenario we talked about. You can't please everyone, so you are forced into compromise or avoidance. You try to negotiate or you build a facade. The third C is content.
Content asks, what are you actually being asked to do? Is the demand consistent with your internal organizational goals? If a hospital is pressured to adopt a new surgical checklist that clearly saves lives, that aligns with their goal of patient care. They will comply.
Yeah.
But if the pressure heavily restricts their discretionary control, if the government tells the doctors they are only allowed to spend 6 minutes per patient, that violates their core professional norms. That is going to trigger defiance.
You push back when the rule threatens your core identity. Fourth factor, control.
Control focuses on how the pressure is exerted. Is the pressure a strict, coercive legal mandate backed by the threat of prison or massive fines? Strict laws usually lead to acquiescence.
What if it's not a law?
What if it's just the voluntary diffusion of a norm? What if it's just a new trend in your industry association? Voluntary norms are much easier to defy or ignore without facing existential consequences.
And the final predictive factor is context.
Context looks at the broader environmental uncertainty and interconnectedness. In a highly stable environment, companies tend to conform. But in a highly uncertain, chaotic environment like the tech industry during the dot-com boom or the financial markets during a major crash, organizations are actually more likely to use defiance or manipulation.
Because there's nothing to lose.
When the illusion of predictability has broken down anyway, the risk of breaking the rules feels much lower, and the potential reward of rewriting the rules is astronomical.
Now, I have to push back on this framework, specifically regarding that final strategy, manipulation. I keep thinking about DataStream weaponizing the law to crush their competitors. Let's say an organization successfully uses manipulation. They actively shape the values. They co-opt the regulator. They rewrite the rules to favor their own proprietary methods.
Yes.
Don't they just become the source of coercive isomorphism for everyone else in their industry? Are they not just acting as the architect, creating a brand new iron cage for their competitors to suffer in? Is this all just a giant, unending game of organizational hot potato where the goal is to trap someone else before you get trapped?
That is arguably the most perceptive way to interpret Oliver's framework. The answer is absolutely yes. The spectrum isn't a line, it is a circle.
Wow.
If you manipulate the institutional environment successfully, you dictate the new terms of legitimacy. Your idiosyncratic, specific way of doing things becomes the normative standard that everyone else must now mimic or be coerced into following. You transition from being the prisoner constrained by the iron cage to being the warden holding the keys.
That is mind-blowing. The rule breakers just become the new rule makers. And that realization bridges us perfectly into the next major layer of our deep dive. Oliver showed us how organizations react to pressures, how they play defense or counterattack.
Yes, she did.
But in 2006, Thomas Lawrence and Roy Sotheby took this a monumental step further. They asked a totally different question. How do powerful actors purposefully build, maintain, or destroy the very institutions that exert these pressures in the first place?
Yes. Lawrence and Sotheby formalized the concept of institutional work. This research moves us completely away from the early DiMaggio and Powell idea of institutions as these magical, invisible monoliths that just descend from the heavens.
They are just natural facts of life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Lawrence and Sotheby frame institutions as the ongoing, sweaty, deliberate product of human action. Institutional work is defined as the intelligent, situated action aimed at creating, maintaining, and disrupting institutions.
I really love this concept. To me, visualizing institutional work is exactly like visualizing the maintenance of a massive, heavily manicured garden. Think about the gardens of Versailles.
I like this. Walk me through the comparison.
Well, you don't just toss a handful of seeds into the dirt, walk away, and suddenly have the gardens of Versailles. That is the creating part of institutional work. You have to actively terraform the earth.
Right.
You lay the stone paths, you plant the hedges in precise geometric shapes, you divert a river to build the fountains, you construct a new reality. But even after it's built, you can't just brush your hands off and walk away. If you abandon the garden, nature takes over immediately.
Entropy sets in.
Exactly. Weeds grow through the cracks in the stone, vines choke the marble statues, the hedges grow wild. So you have to employ a small army of gardeners to constantly weed the beds, trim the hedges, and police the boundaries to keep the deer out. That is maintaining the institution.
Beautiful analogy.
And then finally, if a new king comes along and decides he hates the geometric gardens and wants to put in an artificial lake instead, he can't just wish the garden away. He has to bring in axes and bulldozers, actively tear up the deep roots and shatter the stone paths. That is disrupting the institution.
That analogy perfectly captures the core thesis of Lawrence and Sotheby. Institutions have a natural, undeniable tendency toward entropy. They degrade over time unless active, constant effort is put into maintaining them. Let's look closely at the three categories of institutional work they outline, starting with creating institutions, building the garden.
This involves advocacy, right? Defining new rules, vesting property rights, and constructing new identities.
Yes, and the text highlights one of the most brilliant, counterintuitive forms of creation work, mimicry.
Wait, mimicry, didn't we just say that's conformity?
But we need to be careful here. This is not the panicked, deer-in-the-headlights copying that DiMaggio and Powell talked about with mimetic isomorphism. This is strategic mimicry. It is used by an institutional entrepreneur to make a radical, terrifying new innovation seem familiar and safe to a skeptical public.
Yeah, the sources give this absolutely incredible historical example of Thomas Edison. I want to spend some time here because everyone thinks they know the story of Edison and the light bulb, but the institutional work behind it is wild. Let's set the stage.
In the early 1880s, when Edison was trying to institutionalize electric lighting, he wasn't just fighting a technological battle. He was fighting against a deeply entrenched, highly institutionalized system of gas lighting.
Gas was everywhere.
Gas was the standard. The public understood gas. They were comfortable with the warm, flickering flame. The infrastructure was embedded in every major city. Electricity, on the other hand, was terrifying. It was an invisible, poorly understood force that could instantly kill you if handled wrong. But practically and technically, electric light was far superior to gas.
But Edison knew that if he ran a marketing campaign emphasizing how radically different and revolutionary and powerful electricity was, he would trigger massive cultural resistance. People would be terrified of putting this death ray in their living rooms.
Precisely. Edison realized that to build his new garden, he had to make it look exactly like the old garden at first. So he deliberately engaged in strategic mimicry. He designed his revolutionary incandescent lighting system to be all but indistinguishable from the existing gas system. He utilized skeuomorphs.
Skeuomorphs, those are design elements that are carried over from an old technology to a new one, even if they aren't functionally necessary anymore, right?
Right.
Like how the save icon on your computer is still a floppy disk, even though nobody's used a floppy disk in 20 years, it's a symbolic bridge.
Exactly. Edison designed his light bulbs to mimic the shape and the glow of gas flames. But the institutional work goes so much deeper than just the shape of the glass. Edison intentionally crippled the efficiency of his own invention just to blend in.
This is the part that blew my mind. Walk us through the wattage issue.
Gas jets at the time produced a light equivalent to about a 12-watt electrical bulb. Now, Edison already had early prototypes of electric bulbs that could produce 2 or 3 times that amount of light. He had the superior technology in his hands.
So he could have blown gas out of the water.
He could have. But he intentionally designed his first commercial bulbs to produce exactly 13 watts. He artificially capped the power of his invention. He undermined the practical effectiveness of his own technology so the light wouldn't shock the public's eyes or their sensibilities.
He intentionally planted weeds in his new garden just so it would look familiar. And didn't he also copy the infrastructure?
He did. The existing gas companies used underground pipes to deliver gas to homes. So Edison insisted on burying his electrical wires underground in the same manner. From an engineering standpoint, this was disastrous. Early copper wires had terrible insulation.
I can only imagine.
When buried in the damp earth, they leaked electricity, shorted out, and blew entire city circuits. It would have been infinitely safer and more efficient to string the wires up on wooden poles in the air. But Edison accepted the massive technical failures of buried lines because the institutional value of mimicking the invisible gas pipes was more important. He lessened the conceptual gap between the old institution and his new innovation.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here. Why are we calling this institutional work? Isn't this just really smart marketing? I mean, Steve Jobs did the same thing with the first iPhone. He made the Notepad app look like a yellow legal pad so people would know how to use it. Why is this sociology and not just a chapter in a marketing textbook?
That is a very fair critique, but the distinction is crucial. Marketing is about selling a specific product to a specific consumer. Institutional work is about constructing the very category of reality in which that product can exist.
That's a good distinction.
Edison wasn't just trying to sell a bulb. He was trying to shift the entire normative framework of society to accept electricity as a legitimate, everyday utility, complete with new property rights, new safety regulations, and a new identity for the consumer. The skeuomorphs weren't just a sales pitch. They were a pacifier for society while he rewired the entire world.
I see. Marketing sells the fruit. Institutional work builds the orchard. But this raises another question. Does Lawrence and Sotheby's theory assume that actors like Edison are hyper-rational masterminds who always know exactly what they're doing? Is every CEO playing 4D chess, plotting out every institutional shift decades in advance? Or are they often just stumbling in the dark and we sociologists are rationalizing it later?
Lawrence and Sotheby are very careful on this point. They adopt what they call a practice perspective. This explicitly means we are not returning to the myth of the flawless, omniscient, rational actor. The practice perspective highlights the culturally competent, knowledgeable work of actors, but it deeply acknowledges that this work often interacts with existing social structures in completely unintended and chaotic ways.
So Edison might have been a genius at this. But a lot of leaders are just throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks.
Exactly. Actors are usually just trying to cope with their everyday lives. They navigate constraints as they arise. They use trial and error. Sometimes they engage in institutional work entirely by accident, simply by trying to solve a local problem that ends up scaling.
Okay, so that's creating institutions. What about maintaining them? We talked about pulling the weeds in the garden. How does an organization pull weeds?
Maintaining institutions involves ensuring compliance through hard mechanisms like policing, auditing, and enforcing rules. If an institution isn't policed, the entropy takes over immediately. But it also involves soft mechanisms like mythologizing.
Creating myths, like George Washington and the cherry tree.
Very similar. Mythologizing in an organizational context means creating and preserving historical narratives that reinforce the normative underpinnings of an institution. Think about how a tech company reveres the story of its founders starting in a garage.
Ah, the mythical garage.
They tell that story at every orientation. It builds a mythos that justifies the current culture of scrappy, overtime hustle, even when the company is worth $1 trillion. You embed the institution into day-to-day routines so deeply that people forget why they are doing it. It just becomes the way things are.
And finally, disrupting institutions. The bulldozers. How do you tear up the roots?
Disrupting involves actively dismantling the mechanisms that hold the institution together. This often involves working through the state apparatus or the courts to legally disconnect rewards and sanctions from a set of practices. It involves disassociating a practice from its moral foundations.
Give me an example.
If you want to disrupt the institution of the internal combustion engine, you don't just build a better electric car. You fund campaigns that reframe gas-powered cars from being symbols of freedom and the open road to being symbols of moral failure and environmental destruction. You systematically undermine the core assumptions that keep the institution legitimate.
Okay, so we've traveled from the macro theory of the iron cage to Oliver's strategic playbook to Lawrence and Sotheby's concept of institutional work. Now, we need to move from the theoretical garden into the mud of real-world application. How do powerful elite groups actually execute this kind of institutional work when their backs are against the wall?
To explore this, we turn to a fascinating 2017 empirical study by Delphine Jabossier. She spent years analyzing the creation of a tool called the Ecobalin, which translates to Life Cycle Assessment, or LCA, in France during the 1990s.
Let's define the tool first. What exactly is a life cycle assessment?
A life cycle assessment is a highly sophisticated environmental performance measurement tool. It is designed to assess the total environmental impacts associated with all the stages of a commercial product's life.
So it's pretty comprehensive.
Very. It measures the carbon footprint and resource drain from the initial raw material extraction through the materials processing, the factory manufacture, the global distribution network, the consumer's use of the product, and finally, its disposal or recycling at the end of its life.
It's a cradle-to-grave accounting of how much damage a product does to the earth. That sounds incredibly useful, transparent, and progressive. So who was building this tool in France? Was it a coalition of environmental activists? Green NGOs like Greenpeace?
This is where the story takes a remarkable turn. The actors driving the creation, standardization, and institutionalization of the LCA in France were not environmentalists at all. They were the absolute apex of the French industrial elite. Specifically, they were engineers trained at the Grandes Écoles.
The Grandes Écoles.
Oh.
Are those like the French Ivy League?
They are even more exclusive than the Ivy League. They are the top-tier, fiercely selective engineering and science institutions in France. Historically, they produce nearly all of the nation's corporate titans, senior civil servants, and industrial leaders. They are an incredibly tight-knit, powerful fraternity that essentially runs the French infrastructure.
Wait, I'm confused. Why would the massive industrial titans, the people who run the cement factories, the chemical plants, the auto manufacturers, why would they want to purposefully invent a tool whose entire function is to measure how much they are polluting the earth? That feels entirely counterintuitive. It's like turkeys inventing Thanksgiving.
You have to look at the historical context of the early 1990s to understand their motivation. These elites were facing a massive rising external threat: the explosive growth of the global green movement and the imminent arrival of strict new environmental regulations from both the French government and the European Union. There was a very real existential possibility that these new environmental standards could severely disrupt their industrial dominance.
Ah, I see. The Green Movement was threatening to build an iron cage of environmental regulations around them, and they realized they needed to respond before they got locked inside.
Exactly. And Dubassier's brilliant analysis reveals that these elites engaged in creative work, the actual scientific invention of the LCA tool, as a highly sophisticated form of maintenance work.
Creative work as maintenance work. Let me make sure I'm tracking the logic here. By inventing this tool, they were actively creating a brand new institution, the LCA standard. But the hidden purpose of that creation was to maintain their own existing power and status quo.
Precisely. The text details exactly how they did this. By designing the environmental performance measurement tool themselves, they were able to embed their own thought style into the very metrics that would be used to judge them.
Let's dig into that. How do you embed a thought style into a math equation? What specific choices did they make?
They approached environmentalism purely as a problem of thermodynamic efficiency and mass balance. They designed the LCA to focus intensely on quantifiable inputs and outputs: how many kilojoules of energy used, how many tons of carbon emitted. What they excluded from the tool is just as important.
What do they leave out?
By framing sustainability purely through complex engineering mathematics, they ignored the more qualitative, messy aspects of ecology, like localized biodiversity loss or the social impact on indigenous communities near mining sites.
So they essentially built a test that only an engineer could pass.
Exactly. Because the tool they created was so incredibly complex and mathematically dense, it required a highly trained systems engineer, someone from the Grandes Écoles, to even perform the assessment. You couldn't just have a passionate activist from an NGO walk into a factory and do an LCA. You needed a specialist software and an advanced degree. They effectively gatekept the entire environmental movement.
That is absolutely wild. So their grand innovation for sustainability was actually a deeply conservative, defensive move. They built a brand new, highly complex room just so they could be the only ones holding the padlock to the door.
If we connect this back to Christine Oliver's framework, this is a flawless historical execution of manipulation. They co-opted the source of the pressure.
They became the regulators.
By taking charge of the LCA, standardizing it, and pushing it to the government as the official metric, they locked out other environmental entrepreneurs, NGOs, or independent scientists who might have created a simpler, more radical tool that would have been far more damaging to the elite's profit margins.
Seeing the mechanics of this makes me incredibly cynical. It makes me wonder, how often is modern corporate sustainability, all these ESG scores, carbon offset markets, green certifications, how often is it just a mask for the elite maintaining their grip on power? Are all these green innovations just the elite making sure they keep the keys to the castle?
It's important to note that Dubassier's text does not make a sweeping, universal political judgment about all sustainability efforts worldwide. It impartially relies on the analysis of elite dynamics within this specific historical French case study. But the study does clearly point out a systemic tendency. When elites face a potential threat to their status, they rarely just surrender. They often try to defend the status quo by, and I am quoting the text here, adjusting to change in a way that continues to favor powerful actors. They adapt, but they adapt on their own terms, often under the cover of creating a new, socially beneficial, institutionalized tool. The LCA was a real functional tool. It did measure environmental impact, but its creation cannot be separated from the elite's deep need to maintain their institutional dominance over the French economy.
It's Machiavellian, honestly.
Yeah.
But you have to admit, it's brilliant. You see a massive environmental tidal wave coming at you. You know you can't beat the wave, so you grab a surfboard, paddle out, and make absolutely sure you are the one steering it when it crashes onto the shore.
That is an excellent visualization of institutional maintenance work. The specific actions they took, defining the methodology, securing the standardization through official channels, establishing the strict educational rules of who gets to use it all, served this overarching goal of keeping themselves at the top of the hierarchy.
Okay, so we just spent time seeing how elites created a highly complex tool to maintain their power. Now we're going to pivot and look at a more recent, incredibly high-stakes example of elites resisting a new tool in order to maintain their power.
Yes, our final source brings us directly into the immediate aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis. We're looking at a 2016 study by Helene Ranelli Weiss and Isabel Holt. They conducted a deep dive analysis into how elite incumbent financial institutions, the massive global investment banks, ferociously resisted new regulations proposed by the European Union regarding over-the-counter or OTC financial derivatives markets.
The dreaded derivatives,
Yeah.
the incredibly obscure, wildly complex financial instruments that basically acted as the match that lit the housing market on fire and crashed the global economy. So after the dust settled and millions of people lost their homes, I assume the EU regulators stepped in and said, okay, the party is over. We need to shine a massive blinding spotlight on this shadow market.
That was exactly the regulators' intent. The EU wanted to introduce total transparency and rationalization to these notoriously opaque markets. They pursued a sweeping regulatory project based on a concept called
A
commensuration.
commensuration. That is a heavy academic word. Let's unpack it. What does commensuration actually mean in the context of financial markets?
Commensuration is, at its core, the process of standardization and translation. It means taking vastly different idiosyncratic, complex qualities and measuring them using a single, universally understood quantitative metric. It transforms qualitative differences into a standard quantity.
Like turning the concept of how heavy is this rock into this rock weighs exactly 4.2 kilograms. You create a common language.
Precisely. The EU regulators wanted OTC derivatives, which were previously negotiated in secret private phone calls between bankers, to be standardized, transparent, and traded on organized public exchanges. They wanted these markets to operate with clear Walrasian supply and demand mechanics.
Okay, another piece of jargon. Let's define Walrasian supply and demand mechanics for the listener.
Leon Walras was a 19th century economist who modeled a perfectly theoretical market. Imagine a giant auction house. An auctioneer calls out a price for a good. If there is more supply than demand, the auctioneer lowers the price. If there is more demand than supply, he raises it.
Finding the equilibrium.
Exactly. He keeps doing this until the market clears, meaning supply exactly equals demand. In a Walrasian market, every single participant has perfect, instantaneous information about the price and the volume of the goods being traded. The EU wanted to force derivatives into this kind of transparent, mechanical, auction-like exchange.
Basically, the regulators wanted to treat these complex, shadowy financial instruments exactly like you would treat shares of Apple stock or bushels of wheat on a public commodities exchange. Everyone can see the ticker price, everyone can see the trading volume, and everything is measured by the exact same ruler.
Exactly. The regulators wanted to introduce mechanical objectivity. They believed sunlight was the best disinfectant. But the incumbent elite financial institutions, the massive banks that made billions of dollars operating in the dark, resisted this rationalization project with everything they had.
Because if everything is fully transparent and standardized on a public exchange, the banks lose their massive hidden profit margins. They lose their exclusive control over these bespoke deals. If a client can see the exact market price on a screen, the bank can't overcharge them by 50%. So how did the banks fight back? Did they use Oliver's defiant strategy and just sue the EU?
No, they were much more subtle and intellectually sophisticated than that. They engaged in profound institutional maintenance work. And the specific strategy they used to fight back, which Weiss and Holt identify as a massive contribution to sociological literature, was the creation of incommensurables.
Incommensurables. Things that absolutely fundamentally cannot be measured by a common metric.
Precisely. The elite banks mounted a massive lobbying and public relations campaign, arguing that OTC derivatives are fundamentally too bespoke, too highly customized, too idiosyncratic, and just too staggeringly complex to ever be priced on a standard transparent exchange.
They argue that these financial products are special snowflakes.
Yes. They argued that trying to force these highly customized products into a standard one-size-fits-all metric would actually destroy their economic value.
Yeah.
They claimed it would fail to serve the highly specific, nuanced risk management needs of their corporate clients.
It's like a high-end, third-generation bespoke tailor on Savile Row in London refusing to use a standard sizing chart, small, medium, large. The regulators are saying, just tell us the chest measurement in inches. And the tailor is clutching his pearls, saying, you don't understand. True sartorial art cannot be measured in mere inches. Every client's shoulder slopes differently. If you force me to use standard sizes, you will destroy the very essence of the suit.
I love that analogy.
But as outside observers, we have to ask the cynical question. Is the tailor actually protecting the integrity of the art? Or are they just protecting their ability to charge $20,000 for a suit without the customer being able to price compare it to at a department store?
If we connect your tailor analogy to the bigger theoretical picture, it encapsulates perfectly the massive tectonic tension between state-driven coercive isomorphism and elite organizational manipulation. The EU state is pushing coercive isomorphism. They are trying to force a rational, transparent, highly measurable structure on the market to protect society. The banks, on the other hand, are engaging in institutional maintenance work by invoking what they call the nature of the market.
What do you mean by invoking the nature of the market?
The banks were actively contesting the universality of the efficient market hypothesis. They were arguing to regulators that not all markets function best with total transparency and standard metrics. They claimed that opacity and discretion were actually necessary features for liquidity in these specific derivative markets.
They are essentially building a giant philosophical fence around their territory, putting up a sign that says, your standard math doesn't work here. Keep out.
Exactly. They also heavily leveraged the inertia of practices. They testified to regulators that the current system, which relied entirely on their localized knowledge, their private personal relationships with clients, and high degrees of professional discretion, could simply not be replaced by a cold, mechanical algorithm on a public exchange.
They warned of disaster.
They warn, with a tone of grave concern, that forcing commensuration would disrupt the market so violently that it would hurt the very corporate clients and pension funds the regulators were ostensibly trying to protect.
It's an incredibly fascinating, almost artistic defense mechanism. They aren't walking into the EU Parliament and saying, please don't do this. We want to keep making billions of dollars in secret. That would fail instantly. Instead, they frame their resistance as a noble defense of customization, idiosyncrasy, and expert craft against the cold, deadening, bureaucratic hand of mechanical standardization.
And this is exactly what makes this case so vital to understanding how institutional work functions at the highest levels of power. Weiss and Hall point out that in modern Western societies, concepts like rationality, objectivity, and transparency have massive, unassailable normative legitimacy. It is exceptionally difficult to stand up in a public forum and argue against transparency and efficiency. It makes you look corrupt.
Right. Anti-transparency is a terrible PR slogan.
So the banks had to perform very complex, highly intellectual theorizing to legitimize an institutional arrangement that inherently favored opacity, secrecy, and elite discretion. Creating incommensurables, convincing the world that these products were simply too magical and complex to be measured by standard rulers, was their way to reject the proposed regulatory framework as irrelevant to their specific situation. They managed to protect their territory without ever having to explicitly reject the broader societal norms of fairness and efficiency. They just argued they were the exception to the rule.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and pull all of these massive conceptual threads together. We have gone on an incredible intellectual journey today. We started with the mystery of the startup ping pong table and Deephas's concept of strategic balance, that constant tug of war between wanting to be uniquely competitive and desperately needing to be seen as legitimate.
From there, we dove into DiMaggio and Powell's iron cage of isomorphism. We explored how coercive pressures from the state, mimetic pressures driven by panic and uncertainty, and normative pressures born from elite business schools force organizations into a passive sea of sameness.
But then we broke out of the cage with Christine Oliver's framework. We saw that organizations are not just passive victims of their environment. They are active agents equipped with a spectrum of strategies. They can acquiesce to the rules, compromise with regulators, build elaborate facades to avoid the rules, openly defy the government, or, in the most aggressive move, manipulate the system to rewrite the rules entirely in their favor.
We then deepened that perspective with Lawrence and Sotheby's concept of institutional work. We realized that institutions aren't natural phenomena. They are gardens that must be purposefully built, constantly maintained against entropy, and actively disrupted. We saw this perfectly illustrated by Edison using skeuomorphs to trick society into accepting the electric light bulb.
And finally, we saw these theories play out in high-stakes, real-world battlegrounds. We watched the French engineering elite use Jabassier's concept of creative work as maintenance work, inventing complex environmental metrics purely to gatekeep their own industrial dominance. And we just saw the global financial elites use Weiss and Hwalt's strategy of creating incommensurables, actively resisting European transparency regulations by claiming their bespoke derivatives were simply too artistic and complex for standard measurement.
It is a comprehensive look at how power, legitimacy, and conformity actually operate behind the scenes of our economy.
I want to take a moment to address you directly, the listener. The next time you walk into your office or you visit a hospital or you are forced to interact with a massive government agency, I urge you to look around with a new set of eyes. Look at the clunky software you are forced to use every day. Look at the specific layout of the desks. Look at the highly specific, seemingly arbitrary metrics used in your annual performance reviews. Ask yourself, are these rules natural? Are they actually making your day-to-day work more efficient? Or were they purposefully built by someone, somewhere, engaging in institutional maintenance work to protect their turf? Whose iron cage are you currently sitting in?
It is a perspective shift that completely changes how you view the organizational world around you. You stop seeing static structures and start seeing the invisible battles for control.
It really does. And before we go, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, extending what we just learned about those financial elites resisting the EU. We saw that the ultimate, most successful defense of the financial elites was to claim their work is incommensurable, that human discretion is required because the derivatives are too complex and bespoke to be standardized by regulators. But I have to ask, wait, no, I'm just going to throw this out there. What happens when artificial intelligence enters the chat?
Oh, that is a truly fascinating collision of institutional forces.
Think about it. If a massive, incredibly advanced machine learning model can instantly ingest, quantify, price, and standardize even the most wildly idiosyncratic, bespoke, complex derivative in milliseconds, what happens to the elite's defense? Does the shield of incommensurability evaporate overnight? If AI becomes the ultimate, unstoppable engine of commensuration, will it be the ultimate disruptor of elite institutional maintenance? Because if the machine can mathematically measure the unmeasurable, maybe there is no dark, bespoke corner left for the tailor to hide in. The regulators might finally get their Walragen market courtesy of an algorithm.
That is a profound question, and I suspect the battle between human gatekeepers claiming idiosyncrasy and AI claiming total commensuration will be the defining sociological conflict of the next decade.
It's going to be wild to watch. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope you leave today with a few aha moments, a deeper understanding of the invisible forces shaping your workplace, and a brand new lens to view the organizations that govern our lives. Until next time, keep questioning the blueprint.